How's that for audio, Kenyatta?
Oh, I hear everything fine. Daryl, we good.
Excellent. I'm
Sounds
good and set up.
Say that again.
I'm good and set up then.
You ready to go, baby? Okay, we're gonna go ahead and get started. So we can make sure we respect everyone's time, because obviously we have a lot of I'm sure that all the attendees on here have scheduled accordingly, probably in the midst of, working projects or working toward getting projects. So in order to respect your time, we're gonna go ahead and get started. I wanna start off by thanking you all for taking time out of your busy schedules and calendars to attend today's webinar. I believe our presenter, who I consider, a true professional in that category, as far as when it comes to understanding how to properly bid and estimate on these DOTD projects. Obviously, there are other ways of doing it. However, I think his way of taking the information that's going to be provided today is going to, hopefully simplify a lot of the information for you all going forward. And obviously, it makes it a lot easier for us to assist you in those areas as well. And speaking of assistance, I just want to let me make sure I share with everyone who's not familiar with who I am. My name is Kenyatta Sparks. I'm with SJB Group. We do DB supportive services for the Department of Transportation here in Louisiana. We're tasked to provide assistance to all firms in Region A. This is the first time that they've decided to split the contract in two. So there is two consultants now. Once again, ourselves being Region 8, which is Baton Rouge, Lake Charles, Lafayette, Alexandria, Shreveport, and Monroe. And you have Urban League of Louisiana that handles Region B, which is New Orleans and Hammond. So obviously, if there's any additional assistance you may need, if you're in Region B, and if you don't have the contact information for your consultant, I'll be happy to assist you by providing you that information. As well as far as myself, I will be putting my information in the contact box. As I view the list of attendees, a lot of the names look familiar. So I'm sure most of you all already have that information, but I don't want to be assumptive and not provide it just in case. Just in case. Once again, our services are in a magnitude of all areas. We don't limit ourselves to what the most common concerns are. We just request that if there's anything you need assistance with, please feel free to give us a call, because our services are free. So we do our best to keep everything internally. However, we do have some great business relationships developed with other resource agencies that work like us, that's like-minded like us, and they will provide assistance that we may not can cover internally. But once again, don't check any boxes. Just give us a call and let us assist you, and we will lead you in the right direction if we cannot. Today's presenter is going to be, let me do a little housekeeping real quick before I introduce him. You should have all received an email of the handouts to be able to follow along. Obviously, there will be a PowerPoint presentation that you will be able to view, but to make everything easy as well, I emailed you the handouts that you'll be able to follow, and that is something that you can continue to use at a later time. And even if you go back and revisit the recording, because I will have the PowerPoint presentation and a recording available. Once we've made the edits to our recording, we will have that available on our website. I will be able to send you the PowerPoint presentation. However, the recording will be at our website that we've created for DB supportive services for our region. And I will put that in the chat, but I'll tell you now, it's www.louisianadbe.com. Once again, Louisiana is spelled out. So once again, it's www.louisianadbe.com. And that's where you will be able to go and view the recording of today's webinar. So just give us anywhere between 24 to 48 hours from today's webinar to have that on there, because there is some editing that we will be doing. However, the PowerPoint presentation will be readily available following. And if you have not received the email, because I went based off who had registered up until this morning around 8 o'clock, if you have not received that email, just put your email address of the handouts, excuse me, put your email address in the question area, and then I will have our communication specialist get that over to you. And also, speaking of the question area, during the question and answer period, it helps flow a lot better when we're addressing your questions if you put them in the question area and not in the chat box. The chat, when we have to go back and forth, it kind of takes away from the flow, because sometimes it's duplicate questions and just going back and forth trying to relocate where we stopped off at. So if you can, just to make everything flow better, put all your questions in the question box, and that way we'll be able to move accordingly. Any questions that we are not able to address via the webinar, we will be able to address those in written form, once again, following today's webinar. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to be able to introduce today's presenter, today's instructor, Mr. Daryl Ivey. He's one of our professional engineers here at SJB Group. He has a plethora of knowledge in all aspects of DOTD projects. He actually does a lot of the planning and scheduling aspects of a lot of these, roads, bridges, and highway construction projects across the state. He's DOTD's expert witness whenever they need to have someone come in and, break down a lot of the information that's needed for whatever matters, whether it's dealing with the current project or whether it's something that they have to, do legally. And I share that with you just so you can understand that the information that you're going to be gathering today is coming from someone who's extremely knowledgeable in these areas. So once again, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mr. Daryl Ivey as today's instructor. Daryl, you can take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction there, Kenyatta.
Mm-hmm. You're welcome.
As Kenyatta mentioned, he provided a number of handouts for the presentation. These are numbered 0 through 9. You can follow along with my presentation using the one named 0. 1 through 9 will show as slides from time to time as we go along. Okay.
Okay.
During the presentation, I also want to point out that and actually kind of say thanks to the Associated General Contractors of America. They wrote a manual. They've written many documents that are helpful to us. This proposed presentations derived heavily from their publication that for estimating process. It's noted on the footnote of that handout 0. If you want to follow up with and purchase the book. During the presentation, we're going to hit these 6 points, several in general, and then we're going to drill down on all 6 through the course of the presentation. Okay. I'm about to present a flow chart that deals with these 6 areas. Okay. On the upper left, we have the boxes that deal with the decision to bid or not bid a given project. And having made a favorable decision to pursue, prepare an estimate, what is the planning that's necessary to help bring that bid together? Kind of in the middle of the chart is what we're noted as the underlying studies, various things you look into to pull your estimate together. At the bottom is the marker for where we're doing the quantity surveys, the takeoffs, the how much, the quantity determinations, looking at the plans and at the site. Just above that bottom area is the costing of the work. That's where you're actually putting what does it cost to do the work that's in the plans and on the site. And it kind of moves over to those boxes that are stacked up to the right, which is where your focus will be as you finalize and get ready to submit the bid, the bottom right corner of that exhibit. And actually, it's all along the right edge of the exhibit. Eventually, you'll be at the top right and you'll submit the bid, and whether you win or lose the bid, you're going to do follow-ups. Okay? Revisiting that first point, there are various levels of detail depending on the purposes of an estimate. Some estimates are real easy to do. You do it off the top of your head, you get a ballpark number, but it's not going to be that accurate. There's another layer of estimates where you're putting more time and effort into getting the right answer. The answer gets more accurate, more close to being right. Well, in DOTD projects, you're doing what we're calling you're making a hard money bid. That requires a lot of consideration and time and effort to develop that price. We're going to call that detailed construction estimate. The closest cousin would be a unit price estimate. That's looking up what the work usually costs. So we're trying to go one more level deeper in our effort to pull together the best price. And it's going to require the full set of plans. It's going to need, which defines the quantities of the work, the specifications, which are going to describe the quality of the work. You need to look at all this information and develop a construction plan as to how you're going to develop the work. Meanwhile, you're going to prepare a schedule to control the timing of the construction. The bottom point doesn't happen too often in what I'll call horizontal construction, roads and bridges and heavy civil works like that. It's more common in the building trades where the contract's going to allow a certain amount of money for the owner to decide what level of quality it wants to buy for the build out of a building. How much money is going to be allowed for the finishes inside the building. Okay. There's several needs you're going to have for the detailed construction estimate. You're trying to get, as you look at the plans and specs, you're trying to get similar work together so they can be priced in big lumps. I can do 10 at a time, so to speak, with one good effort. You're looking at the construction plans, you're developing the construction schedule. You're going to pull together the cost for the labor, the material, the equipment, your subcontractors, and any other services that you'll need to accomplish the project. There's a concept of direct and indirect costs. Your direct costs are what it actually costs to put that footing in place for a bridge, or to put up a sidewalk, specific sidewalk, the concrete, the forming, the resteel that goes, mesh that goes in the sidewalk. The indirect costs are largely anything that's not a direct cost. They tend to be very time dependent. They have a daily cost, and that's going to be your superintendent, your equipment that you provide at the job. It might take a yard if you want to set up a yard because of a long duration project, a place to store your materials. Those are the indirect costs. They're not directly cost for that footing, but it's a necessary cost to get that footing built. You're going to have to come up with a plan to make sure you can get your quotes from your material men and your other subcontractors. As a manager, you're going to be summarizing all the elements of the work in the fashion necessary to pull together the bid. And as managers, you're going to have to analyze the risk of the project. That's going to influence the amount of markup, the amount of profit that you'll apply to your bid pricing. Okay. Well, one little word of caution here, estimating is not a science. There's an art to it. It does rely on a bit of science. We call it the law of averages. And basically, you'll do your best effort to get as close as possible to the right answer, but I'll make it simple. Everything you write down is going to be wrong. We're counting on some of it being high and some of it being low, so that the average of all of those, quote, mistakes will be the right answer. Okay. Got a few words to say about the use of computers in estimating. First thing is doing estimates by hand will always be used. As you use computers to do your estimating and to do your cost control on your projects, always keep the data for a given project separate from the data for other projects. Don't average that data. You need to keep the pieces historically accurate. Some discussions about software programs, okay? You need to know how the science and the art of estimating so that you don't rely on the computer, and probably even more importantly, you can still get your estimate pulled together and finished in the event the computer fails you. You need to know what the assumptions are made in the programmer as he prepared that estimating software. Kind of a word of advice: if you're only pricing something once, you'll probably want to do that by hand. The computer pays for itself. It's going to be harder to do that one thing by computer. The computer pays for itself by the duplication, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth time that work gets done. You're going to use the computer for the high volume, the repetitive work. A computer only does what you tell it to do. It doesn't make mistakes. Computers are very handy for quantifying the takeoff information using the spreadsheets. The computer may give you access to the CAD drawings, the electronic drawings that the project was developed from, and you can use that tool and the tools that are within that software to quantify the work that's present. It's real handy in earthwork projects. And finally, on this slide, the computer is very adept at presenting the information of the estimate in various fashions, different types of reports, so you can look at different things in detail, okay? So kind of as a review of the big 6 points, you're going to have, the wrong slide there. Next slide, please. So to review the 6 points, you have the bid, no bid decision, and having made the decision to bid, what planning is necessary to make the estimate happen. You're going to do some underlying studies. You've got to do the quantity survey, the takeoff. You got to price the work that you saw in the plans. You got to pull all of those details together in a process, and you're going to decide how much that work is worth. What is the profit I need to apply to the cost of the work to, in total, make my bid? And then you're going to follow up, win or lose, after the fact. Okay. Coming back to the first point, notice I got kind of a light blue title just under the red bar on that slide. You'll see that 5 more times. That's the big 6 bullet points we just covered. So as we're looking at the decision to bid or no bid, I recommend that you develop a consistent fact sheet to help you describe your projects one from another in a consistent fashion as you go forward. And that fact sheet needs to deal with things internal to your company and also external to the project, okay? Things to look to for your internal reviews are listed on the slide. Do you have time to bid the job? Do you have sufficient bonding capacity? Is it consistent with the type of work you want to grow with? Do you have the people to do the job? Does it cost too much to pull together to do all the work to make your bid possible? What else are you bidding on at the time? Do you have the necessary equipment? Do you have your supervision on staff? Do you have sufficient support personnel? Is your cash flow in good shape? Do you have adequate other resources necessary? Okay. This slide presents some of the things you think about for external considerations on your bid, no bid decision. What's the competition look like? Are you experienced with the owner or your general contractor if you're a subcontractor? What shows in the plans is the design adequate for your understanding of the work? Are there any onerous conditions within the contract itself? What is the quality of the documents? What's the labor market where the project is? Do you have necessary licenses? Is it a type of project that you want your company doing in the community? Can you get necessary suppliers and subcontractors? Does the contract permit sufficient time for you to build the job without getting into problems? Do you have the cash flow available? And are there any special requirements that need special attention, management attention? Okay. Here's a second big point. What are some of the underlying studies we'll undertake when we make the decision to bid on a given project? In big picture, we're going to have to investigate the site. We're going to have to plan a method to accomplish the project, and we're going to have to develop a construction schedule. Okay. As we go, there's some preparation to do before we actually investigate the site. Who are we going to send to investigate the site? And how are we going to prepare for that site visit? We're going to need to study the plans and the specifications. We've got to develop a preliminary construction plan. We've got to determine what's the significant pieces of the work that are in those plans. We've got to make some tentative decisions on who we're going to use for subcontractors, and we need to understand where we're going to get local supply of materials. We need to kind of predetermine what equipment we might need. You also need to prepare your questions that you're going to ask if you have a site visit that the owner is going to conduct. Some of those site visits may be required. If it's a required site visit, make sure you sign whatever the attendance roster is. You want to look ahead to see what transportation's available. You may want to do some determinations of what the geophysical conditions are at that work site. What's the dirt like? It's not so much a problem in South Louisiana, but in some areas it might be very hilly, which can affect your equipment decisions. And in other states, you'll run into rock and boulders maybe in the ground. You may want to consider contacting some of the local contractor suppliers and subcontractors. When you do the site visit, you want to take pictures. You want to record the day and time and location on those photos. You'll want to take a video record and talk while you shoot that camera. You want to look at the ground and consider the ground surface and the potential conditions that it may present as the weather conditions occur. You might want to look and pay attention to clearing and grubbing requirements. You'll want to look for your utilities, not only for the purposes of where are you going to get your water, where are you going to get your electricity in the sewer connections. You're also going to be looking at the existing utilities that may affect the work that you need to do upon successful bid. And you also want to keep in mind that you may need a lay down yard. Where is that going to go? What is it going to look like? As you're at the site, you're also going to evaluate site access and what are locally available resources and necessities. You got the site access to look at. You got local labor to evaluate. What are your sources of material? What equipment are you going to have to use? Who might be your subcontractors? What other services and local support is available or necessary? Are there any unusual government regulations for that project site? You'll want to prepare a written report, again, in a standard fashion for your site visit. And be sure to ask those pre-bid questions if you have an owner-sponsored bid conference or a site tour. Okay. In your handout, it's number 2. There's an outline for what one of these typical site reports might be. If you have a standard form before you go on the site visit, it might help you not miss some of the things you needed to ask about. This is just the first page of that handout. I think it's like a 5-page handout it's a 5-page document in the handouts. Again, that's number 2. Okay. Okay, here's some words on the planning of the construction method. And basically, how are we going to build the project? What is the sequence of the work? What do we need in equipment, in regards to equipment to accomplish that work? Are there any temporary works? I need an access causeway, a trestle, a cofferdam, those types of things. You're starting to develop your plan and getting organized for your construction operations. You want that plan of operation to be straightforward and simple. Your specifications may dictate parts of that plan. You want to consider various ways, different methods and sequences to accomplish the work. You want to evaluate potential risks for that work. You need to pay attention to what's the season of the year that various parts of the project are going to be done. You need to develop how you're going to coordinate your own forces and the effort of your subcontractors. You got to pay attention to the time allowed for construction as you make your equipment and plant decisions. Do you have the necessary equipment owned? What are the conditions of the work may affect the choices of certain equipment? Time constraints make you change your plan to, for instance, double the amount of people that you're going to put on the job to be able to work in half the time. You need to know your labor force, their skills and knowledge about this type of work. And you're going to look at comparative studies to drill down on some of these topics. Some of the examples might be you want to evaluate different ways to approach the work. You may want to compare the cost doing the work with different types or sizes of an piece of equipment. If the quantity varies depending on your method, you may have to price the work for each of those methods. You might want to compare the cost of alternative materials. You'll need to compare estimates for each of those methods. Okay? This slide is just a sample of one of the comparative studies. In particular, it's using It's evaluating the difference in cost per unit price, unit cost, using different size of a crane, clamshell in particular, sitting atop a barge. One's a 3.5 cubic yard clamshell bucket, and the other one's a 5 cubic yard clamshell bucket. What is the impact on the costs, production costs? And you can look at that in detail, but that's just an example of one of the comparative studies you might do. Okay. Let's spend a little time talking about the preparation and the construction schedule. Remember those indirect costs we talked about earlier. That's the time-dependent ones. You need to make sure all of those are consistent with the schedule we're going to develop. Construction methods may determine the logic that you use, the sequencing of the activities that you use as you develop your schedule. Your estimating team needs to consider the time it takes to perform the work. They're looking at the direct costs of the work primarily. They need to stay focused on the minimum cost for the work, that portion of the estimate. It's not the estimator's prerogative. They're not to decide how much money should be made for the work. Their job is to report what is the cost to do the work as shown in this estimate. It's the management to make that latter, the markup decisions. When you're developing the preliminary schedule logic, you want to look at the bid documents because those may dictate certain work sequences. You need to pay attention as to how the contract defines the project start. Is it based on the award of the contract, or is it based on something that usually happens a little later? And this is a notice to proceed, the start of the assembly period in DOTD language. You need to pay attention to the contract as to how time is measured on the project. Is it in working days or calendar days? Does the specifications require you to consider weather? You'll need to review the specifications as to how that is to be determined. Certainly you want to remember weather as you're doing your estimate. There may be milestones in the contract too, which are interim completion dates. I want to be able, an example of that would be if you're working on a building that's being used by the occupants, there may be a requirement that the building be available. Different parts of the building may be required to be available during certain periods of time before they'll turn it over for you to work in that area. And they may have a requirement for you to finish in that area by a certain time. That should be in the contract. The more of these interim dates, these milestones there are in the contract, the more risk is going to be involved in your estimate. And you need to consider the availability of your materials in your schedule. And that's kind of important. An example of that in the New Orleans area, actually all along the rivers, barge access often becomes on. A lot of rock comes either by rock or by rail. And the big quantities of rock might not be available when the river is high in the spring. The schedule needs to evaluate the procurement of key items, especially those that take a long time to be built, prepared for your job for delivery. You need to consider the time it's going to take for the owner's inspection and testing activities. You need to provide time for your submittals and your shop drawing preparation and submittal and review. Your assembly period allows a lot of work to be done during this mobilization period with certain rules. You need to consider your weather restrictions. It may get too cold to perform certain types of work. Access may be limited certain times of the year. That needs to be accommodated in the schedule. And your equipment requirements may require you to do the work sequentially, or you may be able to do it concurrently. Sequentially would be one after another after another. Concurrently would be able to do that twice as fast, side by side, so to speak. When you're doing your schedule, you need to look at some of your more expensive pieces of equipment so you can make the decision whether to leave that from time to time. That equipment's not going to be used. Should it stay parked on the job in between uses, or should the extra money be spent to demobilize and remobilize that equipment later when it's needed again? There's a cost check you need to perform. So things to think about as you're developing your preliminary schedule include the activity durations. How long are these things going to take? Individual activities going to take. Don't forget those long lead time items for material or equipment. The time available for the work may be required by the contract. Got to watch out for those interim milestone completion dates. Some of your activities may be weather sensitive, certain times of the year, etc. To some degree, the time to perform the works can be a function of your local labor and your subs availability, the types of material you use, the types of equipment you use, and is that equipment available? You got to provide the time for the owner's reviews and inspections, and you need to pay attention to your cash flow. Faster tends to make for a higher burn rate of your available cash, and you afford to work in that fashion. You may also need to develop some special schedules. These might be labor loaded or your equipment loaded, and that's like a labor loaded schedule. How many people does it take for this activity? These activities stack up. Some of them are done all at the same time. At the end of the day, you're trying to figure out how many people you have on the job site in total. And it also means to use a schedule to evaluate the cash flow. There's faster ways to conduct the work in the schedule versus slower ways to conduct the work in the schedule. Okay. Now we're getting to another major bullet point, quantity survey. It involves the preparation to do the takeoffs. And it's going to be based on a complete set of documents. The purpose is to evaluate the cost and time for a project. And it must include all the material and items of work required, including the temporary and permanent materials required to construct the work. Prior to the start of the quantity survey, you want to review the instructions to bidders. You want to look at the technical specifications. You want to look at the general and special conditions in the contract. And you need to look at the proposed form that you're going to turn your pricing on. All of that may affect the ways how you go about taking off the work and assembling the price for that work. You're going to review the following: the breakdown of the price, the alternative price, whether you're turning in a unit price or a lump sum price for items of work. You're going to want to develop a bill of materials for use in this event you're successful in the bid to help you order what you need to get the work done. You want to look at the contract to see if there are any special rules for how to measure the work you're going to be pricing in your bid. and you're going to look for specific descriptions of the scope for the bid items. And making sure you have the quantity survey based on a complete set of documents. You want to use one set of bid documents to control the progress in your takeoff. You need to develop some coding system to show what has and has not been taken off. For instance, using a highlighter to mark what parts of the plan have been taken off. You're going to want to make sure you have checked that you have all the addenda, all the changes to the contract that are made prior to the bid date. And you're going to want to review the bid form for any specific requirements on how to break down your pricing. Okay. Some of the principles to keep in mind for quantity surveying. The bid quantities in that bid form are not for your purposes. They're provided by the architect or engineer to develop the price for that contract for the purposes primarily of comparing your price against those of the other bidders. Often, though, it's in the owner's interest to have those bid prices be almost correct. But just don't forget that they're not necessarily accurate for your purposes. Okay. Some things to remember when you're going about your construction method. You're going to have quantities to be included for the materials you need to buy. You're going to need the quantities to determine how much labor, the quantity of labor you're going to need to install those materials. You're going to have to quantify the construction equipment. Do I need one piece, two pieces, three pieces of those, and one of those, etc. And you need to know these quantities so that you can determine how much services are going to be provided and what's the effort done by the subcontractors. To do this, you might have to list the quantity you find for a given item of work in one or more ways. One thing that comes to mind is, let's say we need to dig a hole to put a footing in. The DOTD specifications basically say they'll pay you for the excavation based on the size of the footing plus 2 feet all the way around. So the hole can be 2 foot larger all the way around, 4 feet wider, if you will. Your construction methods may anticipate a bigger hole. You've got a larger quantity of dirt to remove and a larger quantity of dirt to put back. That's permissible. It may save you a lot of time to do it that way. But you need to calculate two numbers. One, the quantity that the owner is going to pay you by under DOTD rules in that case. And also how much dirt are you removing and putting back. That's determined by your work method. Remember, we talked about the indirect costs. We want to do the direct costs first, but we've got to use that schedule to determine what's the true time required for these time-dependent costs on the job site. An example of that would be, let's say we're going to do 10 footings and we're capable of working and completing our scope of work for 1 footing in a day. We have 10 to do. We're going to have a 5-day work week. It's outside, so we're not going to get 5 done in a week. It's going to rain, so we might only get 3 in a week. Right there, we've gone to 3 weeks to get this work done, not 2. 2 weeks of 5 days. If it's in the winter, the weather may be even worse, so it may take even longer than 3 weeks to accomplish these 10 footings. Okay. We need to keep in mind some rules of measurement, the actual quantities versus the measured quantities. We kind of talked about it on the example of the footings. It has to be based on the amount of work that is determined by your method. And we may also have to do another takeoff based on how we're going to get paid for that work. Okay. In determining the price of a piece of work, we need to have some rules in mind. Basically, you're going to take you're going to do your math using decimal numbers. If something says 10.5 inches, we need to convert that to 10.5 inches so we can get that math going. You're going to want to measure quantities by zone or area within the plans. It might be station to station. It might be using the mile markers. It might be through some other method. You want to do it in a nice, consistent fashion so that your work can be checked by others. You need to establish control budgets to help you monitor the progress through your takeoff. By control budgets, as you sit down to do some work, you may have an idea that it's going to be $500,000 worth of work to do. And as you're progressing along, well, my takeoff so far adds up to $250,000. We have an idea that you've got another $100,000 to price to complete your effort. So you can kind of keep a mental clock going as to how long your estimate's going to take to pull together. If you do these in a good fashion, it will help you build your schedule if a CPM schedule is required by the contract. Okay. As we're doing the quantification, the work takeoff, we need to remember we're going to have to do this to industrial standards. You got to do it for the actual materials. You got to do it waste factors, and you're going to have to quantify for shrink and swell. By these, we mean all your pipe, precast concrete pipes can be in 4-foot lengths. You can't buy a half a sheet of plywood. You're going to have to include your price for the whole sheet. That's some waste factors. As you're handling dirt, it shrinks and swells as you go through the process. It's in one volume in the ground. As you dig it out, it's going to fluff up. If you have to haul that somewhere else, that fluffy is going to be a bigger quantity than you dug out of the ground. And then when you arrive at the site, if you're going to have to pack it into place, the end volume is going to be even smaller than what you dug out of the ground in the first place. You have to evaluate the cost of dealing with those various conditions of earthwork as the work proceeds. Okay. Got a few words on the accuracy of quantities. Calculation of the quantities. There's a caution when you're scaling dimensions. Have some suggestions for maintaining your accuracy. And there's some methods to help with posting these quantities to your estimate sheets as you're pulling together all this pricing information. For the calculation of quantities, you're going to, as you're writing it typically by hand or else in the computer, you're going to make a brief description of what item and where it is located as you proceed. You're going to write the dimensions down. You're going to list the length, the width, and the depth in the same order every time you open up another item of work in your estimate. You're going to write enough in that description of the work to make sure you can positively identify what that work was. You're going to learn and use standard abbreviations and symbols to help speed the work. You want to make sure all your figures are written legibly, and you want to keep things in nice orderly columns. You're going to want to identify each sheet with the project name, the date, who did the takeoff, who checked the takeoff. And as you proceed along, you want to identify your work by the plan sheet number, the section number, or the detail number on that plan sheet. You want to clearly identify the total for each item, which will be posted to a costing sheet. When I'm developing an estimate by hand, I calculate a lot of interim subtotals, things that I don't want to carry forward. When I finally get to that number I want to carry forward and build into the estimate, I'm going to probably circle that if I'm doing a handwritten estimate. You want to adopt standard coding and marking systems so that the items can be checked and your posting of those items can be easily identified as you progress the estimate. When you're scaling dimensions, never use the scale if written dimensions are readily available. Before you scale that detail, you want to make sure it's the scale and not just a schematic. You want to use the given dimensions for the smallest dimension that might be used as a multiplier. For instance, the 16-inch standard spacing for studs. You would want to write down 4 at 16 instead of the total foot for the wall. We have some suggestions for maintaining satisfactory accuracy as you go along. You want to learn to convert fractions to decimals readily. Get that in your head so you don't have, or maybe make a cheat sheet until you learn these things so that you don't have to run the calculator to figure out that 1/8 is 0.125 inches. It's generally faster and more accurate to convert the fractions to decimals. It's seldom necessary to use dimensions that are too accurate. Quite often, 1/8 of an inch is closer to 0.01 feet, which is good enough. That lets you jump out of inches into feet quicker. For dirt work, 1/10 of a foot might be plenty accurate. That's a little over an inch. The more expensive an item is, probably the more accurate you would need to be with that math. And you need to consider industry standards when you're taking off the material quantities. Again, plywood sold in sheets, pipe sold in joints of pipe, steel pipes sold in what's called double random. It averages 20 feet, but it can be plus or minus 2 feet long, 18 to 22 feet long pieces. You're eventually going to post these quantities to an extension sheet. You don't want to carry more than probably 3 significant figures, 3 numbers behind the decimal point every time you write the number down. Okay. Here's some words on how we prevent mistakes. Going to look at common mistakes. We're going to learn to self-check as we go along. We're going to do our work in a consistent fashion for checking by others, and we're going to look for other errors that are common to this process. Some common mistakes are items are missed entirely, or items are doubled up on, or a decimal point gets put in the wrong place, or your columns get totaled with a calculator, but you didn't run a tape or a spreadsheet. You might transpose a number, or you might have a number that got corrected or changed, but it's not changed from where it was posted originally. As you proceed, you want to check your work all along. You'll develop a sense for what's the right answer as you're running that calculator. And you ought to at least be able to tell if you're close as opposed to off by a factor of 10. You also want to use standardization so that your work can be checked by others. Quantification sheets, cost sheets, have a lead estimator check all the work. Have others make a quick look to see if you've made any mechanical mistakes in pulling together your numbers. You want to check the night before you turn in a bid just to make sure that everything is in good shape. You want to recheck those plugged numbers. Those are numbers that you had to write down because you're anticipating some subcontractor or supplier to give you a number. How many of those numbers are still your number, your best guess, or have they all been replaced with a quote from a materialman or a supplier or a subcontractor? You'll also want to recap all these, check all these things again a couple of hours before you finalize that bid. Some other errors to check for: you want to check that all the numbers got transferred to the proper documents. You want to check that they match the scope of work. The amount of work is the total about right for the amount of work that you envisioned. And are there any math mistakes? You don't want to rely on your calculator for reasonableness. You want to keep in your mind, is that number going to be right or not, about right or not? If you're going to add together 3 or more numbers, you probably ought to run a calculator with a tape or a spreadsheet. And you want to set up the cost sheet with columns so you can do what we call crossfoot. Add the numbers horizontally and add the numbers vertically. And both the sum of the vertical computations, when you add those up horizontally, those should add up to the numbers calculated the other way around. You might want to have somebody that's familiar with the work just to look at your work to see if that looks about right. You're going to want to photocopy every sheet after every check and note the date and time of the copy. This is to allow you to check sheets that get changed later against that original photocopy sheet that picture of that sheet you made before, just to help you keep track of things. Okay. Again, we're working on pulling together our takeoff. There's some ways to get organized. There's ways of keeping track of what we've measured. There's formal ways of pulling this information together in quantity sheets, and there's ways to organize the work for getting this work done. Okay. This is just a slide to show you that you want to come up with standard forms for the various types of steps that you'll take as you pull together your estimate. Design your own. There are examples in the handouts. I think it's handout 4. Okay. In getting organized, we want to perform things in a consistent order. Generally, we won't want to follow that sequence of construction. We want to keep detailed notes of anything we run across that's a conflict, an error, an omission, or a question. As you proceed with your work, you want to write down all your assumptions. You need to remember to read your technical specifications, your standard specifications, and look at the plans. If there's a discrepancy in the plan, generally the larger scale detail is going to take precedent over that smaller detail. As we're keeping track of what has been measured, we want to mark the plans and establish some coding structure in your documents to identify what has been taken off. And you're going to generally want to follow the sequence of construction you have in mind as you do the takeoff. On the quantity sheets, you're going to want to list dimensions and calculations of quantities on the forms you have. Items to consider for consistency include identify the source of each entry in your documents according to the drawing number, the plan, the section, etc., from which you're working. You want to learn and use standard abbreviations for your work. You want to list the number of items and the dimensions of your takeoff in the same order every time you write it down. You're going to list dimensions as feet and inches or feet and decimal. And you want to identify each final quantity that's going to get posted on another sheet in some fashion. Circle it, underline it, highlight it, whatever suits the purpose. Some ways to organize this quantity takeoff work. You want a separate recap sheet for each bid item. Your takeoff may span multiple sheets of paper. This gets pulled to a recap sheet to recapitulate the information from those multiple takeoff sheets. You're refining and improving the information as you carry it towards a total estimate. You need to have an organized way to split a given subcontractor's bid when his scope of work spans more than one bid item. In quantifying subcontractor work, you need to do that so you have some idea whether or not that subcontractor's number is going to be correct. Remember, he's going to be later on in your bid process before you finally hear his number. So you need to develop a number in your mind, at least, preferably in writing, what you expect his price to ultimately be. This will help you recognize when your quotations might be out of line. It'll help you check the scope of the subcontractor's proposal. It may help you understand any special problems encountered by that specialty subcontractor. It may help you evaluate the time allowed or required by that subcontractor. It may help you get an idea for the cost of what might be missing from the scope of that subcontractor's quote. Over time, it'll help you develop a historical cost for that type of subcontractor's work. It'll help you gain a better understanding of the overall project. It'll help you better understand your time schedule, and certainly it'll help you better understand the quotation when the subcontractor or supplier gets in touch with you to provide the price for you to pull into your bid. A word on outside quantification services, they're available, but be very cautious. They may have some assumptions and ways and procedures that aren't consistent with what your requirements are. Certainly they should have experience in bidding the specific type of construction that you're asking for their work on, and they should have knowledge of the sequence of work that's to be used. At the end of the day, that these outside estimators almost never assume the risk for their own mistakes. Okay. This is kind of an overview of the various steps it's going to take to pull together a large estimate. The top left corner is where you spend a lot of the time doing your quantity takeoffs to get them onto the cost sheets. You see the dotted line across the top of the chart? That's showing you the various parts of your estimate that are served well by within a spreadsheet. There's a lot of redundant math that the computer in a spreadsheet will help you process. Along the left side of the page are the various documents you're going to use as you move your takeoff towards a price for each bid item to ultimately a total bid. And as you move along, you're first going to identify the total direct cost of the individual work. Then you're going to add your indirect costs, which the sum of the indirect and the direct are your total costs for the work. And ultimately, management is going to have to evaluate some differences in quantities as they're working into the decision for what markups to apply. These markups will have to cover the corporate overhead and also the profit. And they need to be incorporated into the bid in a manner that's consistent with the bid you're ultimately going to turn in. Okay. Again, that's in your handouts. Another big bullet point, costing of the work. Got a refresher on what we're calling the direct versus indirect costs. We're going to introduce the term elements of cost, and that's the various types of costs that go into a particular piece of work. And I'll also make the comment that each of those elements could either be direct cost or indirect costs. And generally, you're going to want to develop your price as you're preparing your estimate. You're going to want to keep the elements of costs separate from one another. In other words, your labor is going to go in one column, your material will go in another column, your equipment will go in another column, subcontractors, outside services, etc. Okay. This sheet's just to kind of reinforce the concept of the different elements of costs across the top and the different cost categories, direct and indirect, on the left side of the document. Okay. As you're determining the cost of a piece of work, you're going to determine the labor cost, and it has an adder that's the burden. It's a percentage of increase of the labor that typically goes for taxes and other considerations. You'll have your material costs. You're going to have your equipment costs, your subcontractor costs, your outside services costs, and all those elements of cost are going to come together to determine the unit costs for the given piece of work. Your labor and burden costs are determined by how the work is to be done, how much work is to be done, who does the work, what trades, what skill levels, et cetera, are going to do the work. That affects the rate of the hourly rate for the various people involved, and how long will it take for each of the crews to execute the work. When you're looking at your material costs, you're going to need to determine whether you're headed towards a unit price or a lump sum price. You need to include your sales taxes, your delivery costs, the cost for any warranties, the purchase of any patent rights, those kinds of things. As you're looking at your construction equipment, you're going to have ownership costs and operating costs, and we'll talk about those later. Your subcontractor costs, your services and other costs. Okay. This is handout 7, and it just gives you an example of how you might go about determining the unit cost for labor to accomplish a particular type of work, piece of work. Okay. Okay, now we're going to look back and revisit the cost of labor and the labor burden. You're going to have to determine what the average cost per person per trade is going to be. And each of those may have a different burden rate. I might add in here, you might have a minimum wage determination that's a part of the contract, especially in public works. You as manager of the company, you're going to need to realize that you have different skill levels present among your workers. And you need to keep in mind the circumstances and conditions that exist when these people are going to be performing the work. Is it rainy? Is it excessively hot? Those types of considerations can affect your productivity. In addition, different crews may have different levels of productivity. You're going to have your A team and your B team. They may be helped by choice of equipment. Bear in mind that you need to know what's the defined scope of work for each of these items that you'll be pricing. What are the details in the plans and what are the specifications say about this item that you're developing your cost? What conditions and circumstances affect your productivity in determining the cost of the work? Any data you use, how accurate was that information as it was developed? In the historical data, you want to look here for recent production experiences regarding similar work. Your historical production may not be necessary to be modified due to different circumstances and conditions for this given project you're pulling an estimate together for. Some tips when using historical data: use it only from specific projects. Again, don't average together, don't add together your data as you collect it over time. And you only want to use data from projects with similar circumstances and conditions. And you need to identify adverse factors that might have affected the historical data you're using, or might make your current needs different from that you're seeing in the historical data. Remember, there's some factors that you can control that affect your productivity. This includes the quality of your supervision, the skill of the individual labor, and what tools and equipment are made available for their use. By the same token, there's some things that the contractor cannot control. Some of these might include the detail of the work, how much repetition and quantity of work there is, what's the weather conditions, what are the site conditions, what are your work conditions, what is the quality of the owner, the architect, engineer, and the contract documents. Okay. This is just a reminder how how significant the labor burden can be relative to what we readily see as the cost, the labor cost. You know, it adds half again to what we expect as a labor cost. Okay. As we're doing our direct material costing, we're going to have to include our permanent and our temporary materials. We need to track them appropriately for whether we're quoting lump sum or as a unit price. We need to account for reuse of temporary materials. An example of that would be cofferdam sheeting, where you would use it for this footing and then reuse that same steel sheeting at the next footing. Or form material may be reusable, that type of thing. It saves it, it affects the cost to accomplish all of the work. And you also need to look at the impact on price on any discounts that might be offered with purchase and payment conditions. In all, you want to determine the best supplier prices. And you may need to go expedite some quotations that to help you pull together your estimate. Some words on determining that best supplier price. You need to make sure it's responsive, that that quote deals with everything you needed to cover. And then determining that best price, you need to confirm that the quoted work meets the required specification. That it uses the exact materials required by the contract documents. You want to make sure this vendor is able to deliver the shop drawings and the materials. You want to make sure that the person quoting has acknowledged all addenda for the project in advance of the bid. You want to know that that vendor has a proven financial and performance history. And you want to make sure to include all delivery and sales taxes. You want to make sure that the vendor warrants that his price is firm. And you want to touch base, to see whether there are any favorable purchase terms, discounts, etc. Okay. Let's talk about equipment costs. There's several components that go into the ownership cost versus the operating cost for a piece of equipment. Okay. This slide expands on the ownership costs for a piece of equipment. Depreciation, that's the wear and tear, the technical obsolescence, the decline in the value of equipment over time. As you're pricing the equipment, you want to include in your estimate a portion of a cost so that you can get paid on this project so that you can replace that piece of equipment later for the later projects. You need to include the cost that of the loan it took to buy that piece of equipment. You need to incorporate the cost of the insurance to protect that piece of equipment. You're going to need to include the cost to store that material, not only on this job, but to carry it over to the next job. In certain project jurisdictions, there's a special tax that applies to that piece of equipment, the value of that equipment on the site. Some pieces of equipment may require certain licenses and other fees. And you're also having to support whatever infrastructure you have. Larger companies are going to have an equipment division. You got to have that resource covered in the price of your equipment in your estimate. Okay. Those ownership costs are different from our operating costs. Our operating costs, we incur these as we use the piece of equipment. And that's the fuel, the oil, the grease that get used as we run the crane. We also need to include a price based on the use of the equipment to collect additional money so that we have the money in the bank to be able to buy the repair parts and the labor to put those repair parts in. Okay. So in determining the cost of equipment for use in this estimate, we need to do it for each piece that's going to be on the job. We need to make sure we cover the ownership for the entire time that that piece is going to be on the project. This means that you need to refer to that schedule you prepared for this estimate to determine how long that crane is going to be parked from when you used it for the eastbound to then later, sometime months later, be able to use it on the westbound. What does it cost to park that equipment over in adverse weather if you do a winter shutdown? Those kinds of things. Those prices are ultimately going to get converted into a manner that's consistent with your estimate as you build your price for the work. Okay. Some considerations for your subcontractor proposals. You're going to make sure that they provide and cover everything you need in the proper fashion in their quote. Many of us work as subcontractors. This might be a good list for you to revisit to help you better improve how you quote the prime contractors. Okay. Some other things to consider for your estimate under direct services and other expenses are listed here. Okay. Let's revisit some indirect costs that need to be included in our estimate. We're going to have indirect labor and burden costs for our project managers, for our superintendents, for our surveyors, and for our office staff. There are going to be some indirect cost consequences of material for our plant to make the material if we had a batch plant. You might have temporary facilities, the lay down yard and whatnot. You might have a final cleaning of the installed material that needs to be priced. There's some indirect equipment costs that we need to include within our estimate. And there may be a cost to put in the temporary road for the crane access. You might have an additional cost to install and remove a particular crane, like the large cranes take several days to assemble on a site, for instance. Some indirect subcontractor costs might include a fence or a road to accommodate their work. It might be handy if you'll develop a checklist of your indirect costs. An example follows. Okay. Here we have a big long list of things we need to make sure we consider in our bid. That's handout number 9. Getting close, guys. Next, okay. And we're getting to another of the big 6 bullet points. You want to use good procedures to pull your estimate together. You want to handle those last minute quotes in an orderly fashion. You need to determine what your final bid price is going to be, and you need to prepare for the particulars of submitting the bid. Where is it? Is there a train track involved? Those kinds of considerations. Okay. So we want to use good procedures to finalize the estimate. These are going to include checking and managing the process. In determining the bid price, we're going to have a final check of that recap sheet. We're going to have what we call a cut and add sheet. That's a sheet of paper where you're actually using you're cataloging the increases and decreases in price as your quotes come in, and it helps you control what you change, how much of your estimate. Management is going to make a final assessment of risks as you're making that markup decision. More risk should justify higher profit. Now we look at the details in submitting the bid. We've got to check the bid that we filled out in the bid form properly. We've got to come up with a plan for delivering the bid. For instance, if you're turning in a bid at the Corps of Engineers in New Orleans, there's that train track you better be worried about. You need to make sure you include the bid security required by the contract documents. That may be a bid bond, or it may be a check in lieu of bid bond, but you need to follow those procedures and make sure they're in good fashion and form compliant with owner's requirements in the contract. Okay. Now we got to the post-bid follow-up. And we're going to do a follow-up immediately after we turn in the bid. Okay. Here's what our post-bid follow-up is going to entail when we're the low bidder. There's a hint. There's going to be some things that are required pretty soon after the determination of low bidder. You're going to have to turn in some executed performance bonds. You're going to have to provide proof of insurance. You might have to provide a detailed contract schedule. Lump sum prices may need a breakdown of into smaller pieces for use in payment. You may be required to turn in a list of subcontractors and suppliers. You may have to have a schedule to submit. Okay. If you're a successful bidder, there's a transition that you're going to need to manage as you transfer the responsibility for the work from the bid team to the construction team. These guys need to meet so that they can talk in this handoff. And one of the things that needs to get communicated to the construction team quickly from the estimating team is how quick do I need to turn around my shop drawings, and what's the time required for my material deliveries? Are there any special things that you saw in preparing the estimate? Do you have that preliminary schedule? And are there any specific needs in the methods required to accomplish the work? Okay. As a low bidder, we need to establish our project control budget, our job costs, if you will. We're going to need that job cost information to monitor our production costs as we go forward in execution of the project. We're going to need to monitor our partial payments, not only for our bankers, to make sure we pay our subcontractors and suppliers in a timely fashion. And we're going to use the labor budget to help project management to determine the manpower needs. You're going to monitor the cost as you progress to make sure you're within your expectations as you build the work. It's going to allow you to do periodic financial forecasts for business, and it can be used to help motivate better production from your labor. Okay. Okay, what do we do when we're not the low bidder? We want to follow up with our subs and suppliers to see what insight they gain from their contact with other, and hopefully the low bidder. You want to determine where you were high and low so you can better your estimating process for the next project. And you want to save your valuable bid documents. Other uses for your detailed schedule, detailed estimate, especially when you're low, or to develop your list for procurement, your schedule, your list of what you're going to need for the project, and that early shop drawing submittal schedule. Okay. So in review, here are our big 6 points: the bid, no bid decision, and having said go, planning for that estimate. You're going to do underlying studies. You've got to do your quantity takeoff. You got to determine the cost of all the items of work. You got to pull all that together into your bid and apply overhead and profit, and turn in that bid on the proper form in the proper time. And then there's some follow-up to do after the bid. Okay. So appreciate your time and attention, and please provide any questions you might have.
Thank you, Darryl. I appreciate you taking the time to put together some, I believe, some really great information. I thank you for putting together the handouts for everyone to be able to follow. Obviously, they'll be able to follow along with the recording once that's available as well. I do want to offer at this time, before we go into any questions, that if there is anything that you may need some one-on-one assistance with, please get with us because we'll see how we can match that up with Darryl's calendar, so we can see if we can move forward with that as well. Because you've attended today's webinar, that should make it simpler for you to understand any guidance that he gives going forward. Obviously, due to our contract, we're not allowed to actually put together any estimating, any bids or estimates for any of the projects. However, we are able to assist you with any questions and concerns that you may have throughout the preparation of your bid. I do request, as far as to make it easier, if you can provide those questions via email. That makes it easier for me to get that dialogue started between you and Darryl, because I'll just forward everything to him, and in that way I can make sure that the language that's needed accordingly can be matched, so he'll be able to address your question according to how you're asking it, and it just keeps from any mishaps between, you know, with myself transferring the message back over, or the information back over. So now I'm gonna go to the question area. If you have any questions, please feel free to go to the question area at this time to type in your questions. I do see one of the questions is there going to be a copy of the slideshow? Yes, there will be. Once again, we will have that available for you once we've completed all edits. It'll be available at our website, which is www.louisianadbe.com. Once again, that's www.louisianadbe.com. And Louisiana is spelled out. I recommend all firms who are certified already as a DBE and you are located in our region, which is once again Region A, which is Baton Rouge, Lake Charles, Lafayette, Shreveport, Alexandria, and Monroe, to subscribe to that website, because then you will get notifications each time we populate it with new information. And that information would be anything that's with upcoming projects, whether it's DOTD or any other municipalities throughout the state, but also it'll keep you abreast of any current events as far as workshops, webinars, and so forth. So I recommend that you go and subscribe to that, as well as follow us on our social media platforms, which we have Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. And all three of those are accessible through the website as well. You can just click on there and begin to either follow or like. And that's another source that you can use to stay updated with all information. But once again, the slideshow will be available. I will be sending out a copy of the presentation, as well as if anyone did not receive any of the handouts, please just let us know that, and I'll get that to you also. And then the other question I see here, this would be for you, Darryl. What are some good sources for comparative studies / analysis of equipment and alternative materials?
I wish I'd done a little bit more preparation on that, so I wouldn't have to be purpose specific. But there's a lot of good resources out available to help with these types of things. One that comes to mind that I use a lot is there's a publisher by the name of R.S. Means, Ralph Sam Means. They may have been bought by somebody else, but you can find information from them. They make pricing guides that are very industry specific and provide very detailed information. They also provide a method to use their document to pull together an estimate that it's helpful to follow, to read through that to see how they would do it, but I wouldn't recommend running my business using their pricing methods. But it is a really good gut check, especially if you don't have any idea how much labor it's going to take, what size of crew you're going to need for some type of work. And they publish paperbacks. They're industry specific and they're very detailed, good source of information. Another source that comes to mind is published under Engineering News Record. Their specialty is more area, different places in the U.S. They'll provide different prices for different cities, indexed, so you can determine differences for a given, like plywood. What does it cost here versus there? Those types of things. And what does it cost? I have some historical information from 2 years ago. How might I update the price of that work for today's bid estimate? That type of information. Thanks for the question.
You don't like to get into too much, Darryl, but do you have any recommendations as far as any type of software, estimating software that you use? Not to hold, but just anything that someone may not be aware of. I know a lot of the attendees probably already have software that they are currently using, but do you have anything that you would recommend that's more user-friendly?
I like my spreadsheet.
Your personal spreadsheet?
Yes.
So is that available?
Basically, you're going to mirror it after the examples that one of the slides showed 3 different forms on the same view. Basically, build a spreadsheet to support those sheets in the fashion they're shown.
So would you, I'm just asking a question, obviously. Do you recommend the spreadsheet versus the software?
Especially for those starting out. Anything you're going to find for free is probably not going to serve you well as you have success. if you learn to pull your estimates together in a spreadsheet, you're basically doing that manual method with some assist by computer. But you develop a learning, your knowledge of how the estimate needs to go, how it comes together, why you do what you do, following these steps. Just learn it better and more robustly. If you go through doing estimates with a spreadsheet before you start looking at that purchase decision.
So I know
go
that.
buy someone's software.
Oh, I apologize. Say that again, D.
I'm just saying it's somewhat a function of the software isn't going to. It's not going to be wise to use software to make your estimate if you don't know how to build an estimate. That's the biggest I can say. Once you get adept at building estimates, now you can understand what you need of the software so that you can pick the correct software for your purposes.
Okay, that makes sense.
It's not going to cure your problem by going and buying something.
Right. I know that DOTD's website has available the bid tabulations of once the projects have been awarded. How useful do you think that is for the firms to visit that to get an idea of whether if they had placed a bid on a project, but then they realized that, you know, obviously someone else was awarded as a lowest bidder. And I'm talking about from the aspect of a sub. How advantageous is it for them to visit that to try and see if they're in the ballpark with their bids?
I'm going to say that goes about number 2 on your list of things to do as bid follow-up, and that's regardless of whether you're high or low. Very good resource is what that means. There is also another tool that's similar but even more robust. By robust, I'm meaning it's got wider, it has more, it compiles all of these bid tabs over time, and the DOTD updates it quarterly, and it's basically the weighted averages list on their website. And basically it gives you an idea of what an item of work, it's kept by pay item. And it can give you another way of looking at what should an item of work cost historically. The caution there is the project you're pricing right now, how is it like the sum of all the projects that DOTD's gotten in the last year and a half? You don't know that information, so you got to be very careful using that information, but it can be helpful.
And you saying that's what was that you say? Was that the bid tabulation, or did you say that was the weighted average?
Do a search on weighted averages. I think it's the buzzword the DOTD website uses.
Weighted averages. So
it's also it was originally put in there as a tool for the DOTD project engineers to use as a gut check when they're evaluating a contractor's request for more money.
Mm-hmm.
Some project engineers are adept at doing their own estimates, but even then there are some items of work that might not be within a given project engineer's experience. So that's a tool available to them for, it's provided as a tool for that purpose to DOTD, but we can use it for our purpose to help us with some checking of our estimates.
Okay. I got another question. As a new contractor and engineering pursuing licensing, on average, how much time do you dedicate and recommend to be dedicated to the bid compilation? What are the common roadblocks to anticipate getting started?
The time it's hard to answer that because the time required for an estimate is going to be project specific.
Mm-hmm.
As you get better at it, you get quicker at it, you get a better idea as a manager how long each of these are going to take. One of the risks as a bidding contractor is when you find out a job relatively late. And DOTD advertises its projects 30 days before they're going to take it to letting. So if you're monitoring that list of projects regularly, you're not going to have a surprise. But as you start getting interested in work from less rigorous owners, your private guys, you might find out about a job that's coming up for bid that's relatively, you'll find out about it late relative to the rest of the bidders. And now you've got to make a decision, because I only have 3 days left. Is that sufficient time for me to actually do a proper estimate, to risk the money to develop the estimate and to actually perform with the bid that I submit? You have time available to do the estimate properly. You got to decide that in that bid, no bid decision. Common roadblocks to getting started. I'm going to interpret that question to be as a newbie, let's say getting into the business, so to speak. Finding sources of information can take be a learning process. You'll get better at it. You'll get people's phone numbers and better answers as you stay at it. But that first, early in the process, it can be difficult to identify sources of information you'll need to do your estimate with.
Okay. So if there aren't any other questions at this time, obviously I know how things are. You know, you probably don't have any at this moment, but you know, whether it's later on today or sometime tomorrow, the following weeks, you may have a question come up. Once again, I recommend you just shoot us an email. I put all of my contact information in the chat. I get my direct line as well as my email address. If you don't see it, my direct line here is 225-706-5756. Once again, that's 225-706-5756. And my email address is Kenyatta, KENYATTA .sparks, SPARKS, at S as in Sam, J as in Jack, B as in boy, group.com. And once again, you can email me that. Hold on one second, we'll see some other questions. Let's see. I have someone else asking about the software. Any recommendations if we are doing it by hand now to speed up the process? So if they are doing it pretty similar to what you're saying, Darryl, as far as using their personal spreadsheet, is there any recommendations you have once they've become accustomed to doing it that way that can speed up the process?
I'm going to say it's too early for me to answer that right now.
Mm-hmm.
The one point is to have that questioner reflect on their process, and are there some tweaks that can be done in the process as it is.
So if I'm understanding,
maybe you got the best
tweaks in their process done by hand.
Their procedure may be the best answer.
Okay.
It may need improvements. So are there some improvements that can be done to your process, which is a good, robust process? You're just trying to accelerate it.
So if I'm understanding what you're saying, go ahead. I apologize. Go ahead.
And I'm assuming that the quantity takeoffs are not going to go any faster. There's the compiling of the quantity sheets, that's starting to get into the world that the computer can help. But a good spreadsheet design and good design of the spreadsheet so that one worksheet flows, provides information to the next worksheet. All of that might be improvements to the process that's existing now, how to help do what you're doing now faster.
So if I'm understanding,
The decision for
go ahead.
to address which software, it somewhat needs an answer as to what's broken. Okay, I got the too slow part, or can we speed it up?
So if I'm understanding you correctly, the speeding up process could just be something that can be revamped in what they're doing in their by hand process. It may not
It
necessarily.
might what we provided today help streamline or focus or direct something that might be sticky and slow in the process they're using now.
Okay.
And
So,
having said that, reflect on what seems to be broken in the process, because you need that information, as well as what work do we mainly price. And by that, I mean certain software is going to be more adept at supporting certain types of work than other types of work.
right.
Some software is really good for the pipe guys. Other software is really better for the dirt work guys.
So I know. So hopefully I hope that answered the individuals that I hope that answered the question of the individual that requested an answer for that. But if I'm understanding correctly, we'll be able to assist them as far as an aspect of seeing where they're at in their process that may be able to speed up everything for them. And then at that point, if we recognize that everything has been done for them to speed up the by hand process, then there may be some recommendations on software, like you said, that might be able to assist more in the quantitative aspect. So I think that's just a case by case basis. That's why I want to continue to offer you all the opportunity to be able to reach out to us, where we'll be able to assist you in that matter. Hold on one second. Yes, that's correct. Someone followed up saying, so you're saying software may get in the way if the written estimation isn't optimized or streamlined. So I would say yes. I'm gonna let Darryl piggyback in a few seconds, but I would say yes based off of his answer, that the beginning part of that is that we find out where you're at in your process. And then from there, if there's some tweaking that can be done, that may speed up everything else. Once that's been done, then I would say there may be some other software that's available that could speed it up more so from the standpoint of a quantitative aspect, based off of what Mr. Ivory just mentioned. Anything you'd like to add to that, Darryl?
Well, I'm going to remind us that you don't want to rely on the software for the cure to get the estimate done. And what that means is the hand method's never going to go away. And the hand method has got a cousin over there in the spreadsheet that can help you get it done. If the spreadsheet might need a little bit of improvement, how the paper flows and where the data goes in and how it gets added together, those things might be improvable. That spreadsheet is consistent with the way you do things. That software you might not be consistent with how you do things, which then puts the quandary. You need the backup to that new system, meaning you need to be able to finish an estimate that's underway by hand in the event that the software becomes a challenge. Some software might be the wrong shoe. If you needed the software for your right foot and you bought one, it might be fitting the left foot. It might not be a fit for how you do what you want to do. You're going to have to learn the way that the new software is doing things. So that's a cost that's over and above the check you have to write to acquire the software. So long story short, if your current methods really aren't totally broken, then I wouldn't necessarily jump on a fix. Going to a different weight as a fix instead of repairing or improving what you're doing now. For the individual company, I'm not saying software is not the answer. It may be. But we can do that. We can look into that and follow up.
Got you.
That one-on-one stuff.
In addition to what Daryl, and we're going to be wrapping up in the next few minutes, so I wanted to go ahead and get this squeezed in as well. In addition to the great information that Daryl provided on the estimating and bidding, obviously in the effect that you are awarded, and now I'm going to be speaking in the aspect of as a sub. Obviously, if you do win it as a prime, this is information you want to know as well. But more pertaining to someone that's listening in today, if you are a DBE certified firm and you are awarded a project and the prime contractor is going to be using you to satisfy the goal or to go toward the satisfying the goal, there are some more information, some more documents that I believe you need to be aware of if you're not. If you are, great. If you're not, wonderful. I'm going to be able to share that with you now. The prime contractor is responsible to submit the CS 6AAA form 5 calendar days from the time that they've been awarded the contract. That form is provided to compliance programs so that they can see who that prime contractor will be using to go toward the DBE goal. It can be used, they can use one DBE to satisfy the entire goal, depending upon what services, what scope of services they provided a bid on and what percentage of work that is, or it could be multiple DBEs. However, all those firms must be listed on that CS 6AAA form, and DOTD will then review that form, which has to be signed off by all parties, the prime contractor as well as the DBE firm. And that lets them know who will do it, and then they will approve it to make sure that that DBE, this is extremely important, is certified as a DBE to do that line of work. So it's extremely important that, and you have to be certified in those codes 30 days prior to the actual award date. If anyone has any questions on how to make sure that they're certified in the right codes, please feel free to give me a call. And I can also share with you how you can add additional codes, because those codes will play a factor in whether or not you can be used to satisfy a goal. And that's one of the things that DOTD will be looking at when they're prior to making their approval. Now, the other forms you need to be aware of is the OMF -1A and -2A. Those are the sublet request forms. So those forms are letting DOTD know that you are being used, that you're beginning to do work on the project as a sub. So that's the OMF 1A form. So the OMF 1A lets them know what sub has begun doing work on that project. The OMF 2A form informs them of any firms who will be doing work over $10,000. Now, why that's important, because if you're being used as a firm to satisfy the DBE goal, two things. They have a time window that they have to pay you. If they don't pay you within that time frame, which is 30 days from the time they've been paid, DOTD has the power to discontinue any further payments until that payment has been satisfied. However, if you're not listed on that sublet to request, the requested sublet form, they're not notified that you're doing work that would hinder you from being able to put in what's called a prompt payment complaint, because to their knowledge, you haven't begun doing any work on that project. It's extremely important that you know about these forms, because you are required to sign off on both of them. And when they review those, that gives them the leverage to go in and contact, after they've investigated, to contact the prime contractor to get evidence that they've paid you within the allotted time. If they do not, they can't discontinue payments until that has been satisfied. Now, that once again, there's a prompt payment complaint form. If you ever faced with any of those challenges, you have Miss Keisha Green, who handles that at DOTD. Obviously, we don't want that to happen, but if it does, feel free to contact me and I can get you in contact with her and she can take it over from there. And then the other thing, if you are interested in seeing what other codes are available that you can use to add to your certification, please give me a call and I'll show you how to locate that on DOTD site. And I'll also walk you through the process of being able to get them added to your certification. So if there aren't any other questions at this time, once again, if you think of anything afterwards, please feel free to shoot that email to us and we'll get them addressed accordingly. Darryl, do you have any closing remarks?
I would like to thank everyone for attending, and I ask that they be safe and be well.
Absolutely. Hold on one thing. Let's see. We got one last thing. Let's see. Okay. Let me make sure. So, and just to piggyback Darryl's comments, you know, once again, I thank you all for attending. I thank you for taking time out of your schedule because we know that during these pressing times right now, any opportunity that you have is important. So I know you taking these few hours out of your time means that this is important to you as well, just as important it is to us. So I thank you. Continue to be safe. Continue to social distance and wear your mask so we can get through all of this craziness. And once again, I thank you all. And this concludes our webinar for today. Thank you, Darryl.